Welcome back, Embers, or if you're new here, welcome to the Campfire Crew. My name is Stone, my pronouns are they, them, and today we're doing my Project Level Up video. I almost showed you what's going on in my palette preemptively, but before we get started, I just want to say I sound way too happy saying this, I finally got my first transphobic comment, and it was a very light one, and I just want to say, it is still up. So if you're trans and you're seeing my channel and you're wondering why I kept it up, I only delete videos that affect other non-binary and trans people, but for the ones coming at me specifically, I just roast them for filth, and feel free to roast them in my comments too. We're petty here on this channel. But yeah, so if you're trans and you're wondering if this is a safe space, it is. I will always delete anything super hateful or super problematic, but if it's just a stupid little, oh, I clicked out because you mentioned pronouns, what the, I don't care. Yes you do, babe, yes you do, and I'm just gonna flame them in the comments. You can flame them in the comments, but I'm not gonna delete them because it's good for the algorithm. Anyway, just so y'all know, that's how we deal with things here, and feel free to join in. Sorry, like I said, anyway, we're doing my Project Level Up, and I'm on level 2, and this time I rolled in the NYX Ultimate palette, and this is what it was looking like last month. So this was a handy-down palette that I had basically never used, and it looked used, but very lightly used. And so this is what this palette, this is what this palette is looking like after a month of usage. Yeah, that's right. So if you can tell, I have 6 pans that I've removed from this palette. So I'm gonna put up a picture of that, and then let's talk through every color. So none of these seem to have names. There might have been a name thing on the back, but it has been ripped off. I don't know if I did that or the person who owned this before me did that, but it has been ripped off. So I don't have shade names for you. So I just labeled these myself. So the first shade in the palette, we're going to start with this one right here. The first one that is out in the palette, I called it red, even though it's not really red at all. But there were a lot of pinks in this, so I kind of had to label them whatever I could. I used it 2 times, and as you can see, that is no longer in my palette. So this one I removed because I just didn't feel like it was pigmented enough. I actually lost my eyeshadow primer recently, so I didn't expect it to be the most pigmented, but it was patchy, and I just have a lot of pinks in my Love Tahiti palette, and so because this wasn't a very good pink, and because I've used those shades a lot without my primer, and I know that even without the primer, they're still really good, I just decided that this wasn't a very good shade to use, so I decided to get rid of it. The next shade is, I called it pink, and that's still with us. I used it twice and decided that it worked a lot better than the first shade. And also, I felt like it was different enough from the pinks I have in my other palette. It doesn't really look cool toned, but on my eyes, it looks a lot more like purpley leaning, which I don't have this particular depth of shadow in a purpley leaning shade. I have a lot of deep, like very purpley shades, but I don't really have anything like this. And I have been kind of cross-checking a lot of these colors with other things in other palettes, which we'll talk about in a second. But I decided to keep this one because it worked well enough. It was a shade I didn't quite have in anything else, so I ended up keeping it. I have used that twice. The next shade I called Coral, which was a great name for it, and this one worked well enough, but when I was using it, I cross-checked it with, so I actually checked it against this shade right here, which is Coral, in my Be Perfect Cosmetics palette, and it was very similar to that. I basically put Coral and the shade I called Coral in my Ultimates palette next to each other on my eye to see if I could tell a difference, and I really couldn't. I could not tell where I put one shade or where I put the other shade, And I just really love the formula in my Carnival 3 palette, and I just don't really love the formula in my Ultimate palette is what I'm realizing. Most of the shades are just not enough for me. I think they're more of a beginner formula for somebody who doesn't like as bold of a look as I like. And so basically what I've been doing is if it's a shade that I have somewhere else in my collection, I just get rid of it because it's just not as good as other formulas in my collection. The next shade I had in this palette, the last one on the first row, I named Brick Red, and I have not used this yet. So up until this point, we've been ready to move this palette out, but there are a couple shades, starting with Brick Red, that I haven't used yet. I ended up not using as much eyeshadow in February that I did in January and December. And this tends to be a pattern for me. Last year, I feel like it was the exact same. Like I started off really good in the year, and then in February, I never wear that much makeup. There's my birthday to deal with, Valentine's Day, it's a shorter month. And for all of those reasons, I just tend to just lay off the makeup a little bit. So yeah, I didn't end up finishing this palette, and Brick Red I haven't used yet, so I have no idea if I'm going to keep it in this palette. The next shade, the first shade in the next row, is called Dark Purple. I used this once so far, and I ended up getting rid of it. Or sorry, I ended up keeping it. This is also a much cooler tone purple. It's the coolest tone purple in this row. It's in fact the only cool tone purple in this palette. And again, I don't have a lot of cool tone purples anywhere in my palette, in my palettes elsewhere. So I thought it was a really unique color. I still need to use it one more time, but if it applies well enough, and it did last time, I will definitely keep it because it is a shade that I don't have elsewhere. The next shade I called Light Purple. And this one you'll see is gone from my palette. Again, I felt it was too close to a shade from my Carnival palette. So the shade that I thought it was close to is the shade Fruity. So yeah, it's just too close to the shade Fruity, so I ended up getting rid of it. Or was it Tahini? It's one of the purples in my palette it was very close to, so I decided to get rid of it because, like I said, the formula's just not very good compared to my other palettes. The next shade I had was called Light Pink. And again, I felt this was very similar to something in my collection. And also, more importantly for this shade, I just thought it really, really didn't apply to the eyes well at all. And so because of those two reasons, I got rid of it. The next shade is called Lavender. I used it, oh, and Light Pink I used twice. Lavender I also used twice, but it is very similar again to a shade in this palette. Be Perfect has a lot of pinks and purples, and so a lot of these shades in the first two rows were very similar to them. And the lavender didn't in the pan look like anything I had, but when I applied it to the eyes, it looks exactly like Lilac from my Carnival 3 palette, and so I got rid of that one. The next shade I have is called Jean Blue. So the first shade in my third row, I haven't used that. The next one I just called Blue. I haven't used that yet. The second last one in that row, I called Dark Teal, and I used that one time. I thought it was a really nice color and not something I have anywhere else in my collection. But the one next to that I used once, and I found it, despite the fact it didn't look at all like this shade, it looks exactly like the shade Small Spaces in this palette. So I tried this up against it because it actually looks a lot like this shade does in the palette. It looks really bright, but when I put these next to each other, they didn't look at the same at all. But when I put this next to it, despite the fact that this looked way less light and less blue, they looked very similar in the palette. I think these two are so pretty together. I know a lot of people think these are too similar, but I actually find them quite different. But yeah, I found Small Spaces in my Indigo Ink palette to look very, very similar on the eyes to that. And I tried to figure out if the other teal in this palette looked similar to what I called dark teal in my Ultimate palette. And I'm still not sure. I want to test them again next to each other. But for now, I have decided to keep it, but I still have one more use left where I'm going to compare those two shades and see if they're too similar, but I don't think so. I'm filming, babe. What's up? Then we have the last row. The first shade in the last row I called dark green for obvious reasons. I haven't used that yet, but I'm sure I'm going to use that very quickly this month because it is St. Patrick's Day month in March. So these two greens I'm definitely going to use this month. I also have the light green, which I haven't used yet because, again, I was saving it for this month. Once I realized that I definitely wasn't going to be able to finish round 2 for this palette, I decided to keep them to the end. And then we have the last two shades, which I've used both of them. I called the first one Goldenrod and the last one in this palette Light Yellow. I've used these both 3 times. 2 times is in my look today. And Goldenrod is quite a nice shade, and I really appreciate having something like this. I haven't actually compared it to yellow in my Be Perfect Carnival 3 palette, but I don't think they're going to be similar. And even if they were, I like yellow, so I think I'm just going to keep it anyway because I don't have any like traditional yellows in my palette. That's like the only yellow I own. And I really like the idea of yellow shadows, so I'm going to keep it anyway, even if it is similar. And I just thought it was one of the better performing shades in this palette by far. And then the last shade, the light yellow, is not that well performing, but again, I don't have that many matte yellows in my collection. And I used it today and I, got a little bit of payout on it. It's definitely more of a buildable formula. It's not pigmented right away, which again would be great for somebody who doesn't use eyeshadows as intensely as I do, but I do prefer a more pigmented formula. But until I get a light yellow, that kind of shade that works better, I am going to keep that because I just don't have a lot of yellows. So that's where we are with this palette. I have 12 more uses I have to do on all of these shades combined. I have to use the red in the first row, 2 times the dark purple in the second row, once the 2 blues in the third row, the first 2 blues in the first row twice each, the blue at the third blue in that row once, and the 2 greens in the bottom 2 times each, and then I will be done. Like I said in the intro, I am not doing this. There's no panning goal. This is just usage. So next month, this palette will definitely be out and we'll be moving in a new palette, which I'm very excited about. But until then, I will see you guys for my next video. I sound like Laura Force. Bye.